The air in King's Landing was thick with tension. The cries of merchants in the streets, the clanging of swords in the training yards, and the whispers of court intrigue filled the Red Keep. But all of it seemed distant, drowned beneath the single act that had thrown the city into chaos. Eddard Stark's imprisonment. Ned Stark, the Warden of the North, stood in the dungeons of the Red Keep, his wrists chafing against the cold iron chains. He had been betrayed. Littlefinger's smug voice still rang in his ears. "I did warn you not to trust me." His mind raced, replaying every decision that had led him to this moment. He had come to King's Landing seeking justice, seeking the truth, but he had found only treachery. But this wasn't the end. Varys had visited him in the night, offering a choice: bend the knee, swear fealty to Joffrey, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would be allowed to live. Ned had refused. He was no traitor. He would not betray his honor, even if it meant death. Then the idea struck him. Joffrey Baratheon, the boy king, was nothing more than a cruel, spoiled child. He basked in his newfound power, eager to prove himself. And if there was one thing Ned Stark knew, it was that arrogance could be used against even the most ruthless rulers. When the morning came, Ned demanded to see the Queen. Cersei Lannister arrived, draped in her regal golden gown, her green eyes filled with mock amusement. "You are in no position to make demands, Lord Stark," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. Ned straightened his back, despite the pain in his ribs from his captor's beatings. "I invoke an ancient right, trial by combat." A murmur spread through the chamber. The Lannister guards exchanged uneasy glances. Even Cersei's mask of control wavered for the briefest moment. "You have no champion," she scoffed. "Surrey, Elin Payne will cut you down in a heartbeat." Ned's lips curled into the faintest smile. "I will fight my own battle." A hush fell. The Queen studied him, then turned to Joffrey, who sat lazily on his throne. His lips curved into that wicked smirk of his. "You wish to challenge me?" Joffrey laughed, tilting his head in amusement. "You're an old man, Stark. You'll barely lift a sword before I take your head." Ned's voice was calm. "If you are truly the warrior you claim to be, then prove it. Face me in single combat. No Kingsguard, no tricks. You claim to rule by the strength of your right. Then let the gods decide." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Joffrey grinned. "I accept." Cersei turned sharply to her son. "Joffrey, this is madness." "Enough, mother," he interrupted. "Let all of Westeros see that I am no craven, that I am not afraid to spill Stark blood with my own hands." He rose from his throne, chest puffed with false bravado. "At sunrise, Lord Stark, we fight." The hall erupted in murmurs. The court had never seen such a challenge before. Trial by combat was a tradition, but never had a king fought his own battles. As the guards dragged Ned back to his cell, he allowed himself a small, grim smile. Joffrey had taken the bait. Tomorrow, he would either regain his honor or die with his sword in hand. The dawn was breaking over King's Landing, washing the Red Keep in a golden hue. A hushed excitement had settled over the city. The news of the duel had spread like wildfire. Eddard Stark, the disgraced Warden of the North, had challenged King Joffrey Baratheon to trial by combat. And the boy king, in his arrogance, had accepted. The training yard of the Red Keep had been transformed into an arena. High lords, knights and courtiers gathered around, eager to witness a spectacle unlike any other. The nobles sat on raised platforms, while common folk who had managed to sneak in stood in the shadows, whispering among themselves. Cersei Lannister sat rigid on her throne-like chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. This was not how things were meant to go. She had worked tirelessly to remove Eddard Stark from the board, to silence him before he could unravel her family's greatest secret. Now, instead of being executed quietly, he had turned the city's eyes on him. She shot a glare at Joffrey, who stood in the center of the yard, dressed in a suit of golden armor. He was smirking, basking in the attention, the way he always did. When the crowd focused on him, he twirled his sword in his hands, a blade that had never known true battle. The gates to the dungeon creaked open. Ned Stark stepped into the yard, his chains removed, his face gaunt but his eyes steady. He had been given a suit of armor, an old set, slightly rusted at the edges, and a sword that was duller than the one he had carried in Winterfell. A mockery. The moment he entered, the whispers grew. He was tired. He was weakened by imprisonment. He was an old wolf facing a young lion. Joffrey grinned as he raised his sword. "Do you regret this yet, Stark?" Ned said nothing. He merely tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. The crowd fell silent as Sir Barristan Selmy stepped forward. He had been reinstated by Joffrey's command, though he did not approve of this farce. He raised his voice, carrying the authority of a seasoned knight. "This is trial by combat. Let the gods decide." Then he stepped back. For a moment neither Ned nor Joffrey moved. Then Joffrey lunged. The boy king swung wildly, his blade glinting in the morning sun. He aimed for a killing blow, his strikes fueled by arrogance rather than skill. Ned sidestepped. Easily, a hum rippled through the crowd. Joffrey snarled and attacked again. This time Ned met his strike, their swords clashing in a shower of sparks. But Joffrey was fast, striking again and again, each blow growing more reckless. Ned Stark had fought in real battles. He had faced men stronger, faster, and far more skilled than this spoiled boy. He blocked each strike with calculated precision, moving with the patience of a seasoned warrior. Joffrey's frustration grew. His breath was coming in short bursts, his swings becoming sloppier. Ned saw the opening. In a single motion, he stepped forward and slammed his armored fist into Joffrey's face. The boy king stumbled back, stunned. Blood trickled from his nose. The crowd gasped. Joffrey wiped his face, eyes burning with humiliation. "You dare!" Ned did not give him a chance to recover. He struck, his sword slamming against Joffrey's, sending the boy staggering. The king's hands were shaking now, his confidence cracking. Cersei shot to her feet. "Enough of this," she called out. "End this foolishness before—" Joffrey roared, throwing himself at Ned in blind rage. And that was his mistake. Ned dodged, pivoting on his heel. His blade came up, fast and precise. A sharp cry rang through the yard. Joffrey's sword flew from his hands, clattering to the ground. The boy king fell to his knees, gasping. Ned stood over him, his sword at Joffrey's throat. The yard was deathly silent. The great lords of Westeros, the knights of the Kingsguard, the common folk, everyone watched, breathless. Joffrey was trembling. The boy who had played at being king now faced the cold truth of war. He was not invincible. He was not a warrior. Ned stared down at him, his heart hammering. He could end this now. One stroke, and Westeros would be rid of Joffrey Baratheon. His grip tightened on the sword. Then from the edge of his vision, he saw the Lannister guards move. Cersei had risen, her face twisted in fury. "Kill him!" she shrieked. The Kingsguard surged forward. Ned had only seconds to react. He turned his sword and brought the hilt crashing down onto Joffrey's temple. The boy king collapsed, unconscious. Gasps and cries erupted. Chaos broke loose. Ned Stark did not hesitate. He grabbed Joffrey's fallen sword and turned, facing the oncoming guards. The fight was not over yet. The training yard exploded into chaos. The Kingsguard charged forward, their white cloaks billowing as they drew their swords. The Lannister guards followed, shields raised, ready to cut down the man who had just humiliated their king. Ned Stark gritted his teeth, gripping both his own, sword and Joffrey's. He had known this would happen. He had hoped for a brief moment that honor still had a place in King's Landing. But honor had died the day Robert Baratheon breathed his last. There was no justice in this city, only power. The first knight came at him, Sir Mandon Moore, his blade flashing toward Ned's throat. Ned parried hard, forcing the attack wide, and drove his boot into the knight's knee. Sir Mandon stumbled, just enough for Ned to spin and strike his sword against the next attacker, Sir Boros Blount. Blount barely managed to block, but he wasn't fast enough to stop Ned's follow-up strike. Ned slammed the pommel of his sword into the knight's helmet, sending him staggering back. More were coming, too many. The nobles had erupted into a frenzy, some shouting for order, others cheering for blood. Cersei was screaming commands, her face twisted in fury, and Joffrey was still motionless on the ground, his golden armor stained with dirt and his own blood. Ned knew he wouldn't last long. He was already tired from weeks in the dungeon. His strength was failing, his movements slower than they had been in his prime. But if he was going to die, he would die fighting. Then, above the noise, a roar cut through the chaos. "For the North!" The voice was deep, powerful. Ned turned just in time to see a massive figure barreling through the Lannister guards like a bull through dry grass. Jory Cassell, Ned's loyal captain of the guard, thought to be dead, was very much alive. His blade was already wet with Lannister blood. Behind him, a handful of Stark men who had somehow survived the ambush in the streets, fought their way toward Ned. For the first time in days, hope surged in his chest. Jory reached Ned's side, panting. "We don't have much time, my lord," he shouted, parrying a blow from a guard. Ned nodded. No words were needed. Together they pushed forward. Ned's sword cut through armor and flesh. Jory fought like a man possessed, cutting down anyone who stood in their path. The remaining Stark men formed a shield around them, forcing the Kingsguard back, but they were still outnumbered, and the enemy had reinforcements. From the far end of the yard, the Mountain entered the fray. Gregor Clegane, clad in his monstrous armor, his great sword already slick with blood from a man he had cut down just moments before. Ned's stomach twisted. Even in his prime, he would have been no match for the Mountain. Jory saw him too. "We need to leave now." There was only one way out, the gate leading to the stables. If they could reach it, they had a chance. But more guards were pouring in. Sir Jaime Lannister had arrived, golden armor gleaming as he unsheathed his sword. His smirk was gone. This was no game to him. Ned had no choice. He turned to Jory. "Get to the stables. Secure the horses." "What about you?" "I'll hold them off." Jory hesitated, but only for a moment. He gave a quick nod and turned, leading the surviving Stark men toward the gate. Ned faced Jaime, gripping his sword tighter. Jaime raised an eyebrow. "You can barely stand, Stark, and you think you can best me?" "I don't need to beat you," Ned said. "I just need to buy time." Jaime lunged. Their blades clashed. In the flurry of sparks, Jaime was younger, faster. He fought with an effortless grace, each strike carrying deadly precision. Ned was slower, his muscles screaming in protest with every movement. But he had experience. He blocked, parried, countered, keeping Jaime occupied, keeping him from pursuing Jory and the others. For a moment, it seemed as if he could hold his own. Then, pain, a sharp, burning pain in his leg. Ned stumbled. His knee buckled. Jaime had cut deep, his blade slicing through flesh. Ned hit the ground hard, his sword slipping from his grip. Jaime loomed over him, breathing hard. He raised his blade for the finishing blow, and then a deafening boom echoed. Through the yard, the stables exploded. Flames roared into the sky, horses screaming in terror as fire engulfed the wooden structure. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Chaos erupted anew. Guards shouted, nobles ran. In the confusion, strong hands grabbed Ned and pulled him up, Jory. The explosion had been a distraction set by the Stark men. "We have to go," Jory shouted. Ned could barely move, but he forced himself forward, leaning on Jory. The few Stark men who remained had fought their way through the flames, cutting down any Lannister in their way. They reached the gates. Jory hoisted Ned onto a horse. "Ride, my lord. We'll hold them." Ned hesitated, looking back. Jaime was still standing, dazed by the explosion. Cersei was screaming orders. The mountain was cutting through the chaos, trying to reach them. Ned clenched his jaw. There was no choice. He gripped the reins, and he rode. Through the burning wreckage, through the blood-soaked streets of King's Landing, he rode toward the one place where he could rally an army, Winterfell. The streets of King's Landing were in turmoil. Fire from the stables cast eerie shadows along the alleyways as Eddard Stark and his remaining men galloped through the city, hooves pounding against cobblestone. Smoke stung his eyes, but he could not afford to slow down. Behind them, the Red. It was in chaos. The Lannisters were rallying their forces, but the explosion had thrown everything into disarray. He had bought himself a chance, a small one. Jory Cassel rode beside him, his face streaked with soot and blood. "We won't hold out for long in the city, my lord," he shouted over the roar of the panicked crowds. "We need to get to the gates before they shut them." Ned nodded, but pain flared in his leg where Jaime had struck him. He gritted his teeth, willing himself to stay upright. The streets blurred past, merchants screaming, peasants running for cover, gold cloaks scrambling to organize. But Ned knew they would not stay confused for long. The Lannisters had an iron grip on the city, and the moment Cersei regained control, she would unleash hell upon them. Then, as they turned a corner, a line of city guards appeared ahead, blocking the path to the gate. Ned pulled hard on his reins, his horse rearing up. The guards were armed, shields raised, and behind them more were pouring in. A trap. "7 hells," Jory growled. "They were waiting for us." Ned scanned the streets. There were still smaller alleys, hidden paths, but not enough for all of them to escape together. They were surrounded. Then, from the side, a cloaked figure emerged from the shadows. Varys. The spider moved with unnatural calm, his pale hands folded inside his robes. He looked at Ned with something almost resembling regret. "Lord Stark," he murmured, "I did warn you." Jory raised his sword. "We don't have time for riddles, eunuch. Move aside or die." Varys, unfazed, merely sighed. "You do not understand. I am here to help." Ned's grip on his reins tightened. "Why?" "Because the realm needs you alive." Varys turned, lifting a hand. From the alleyways, a group of cloaked men appeared. Smugglers, thieves, cutthroats. They fell upon the city guards with silent precision, knives flashing. It was the last thing Ned expected. Jory wasted no time. "Go, now!" They spurred their horses forward, cutting through the broken line of guards, slicing past resistance. The main gates loomed ahead, but they were closing. "Faster!" Ned shouted. They surged forward, pushing their steeds to the limit. The gap in the gates was narrowing. Jory and 2 of the Stark men made it through first. Another followed, barely squeezing past. Ned was next. Then, a cry from behind. One of his men captured, dragged from his horse by a dozen hands. The gold cloaks were swarming, pouring from every direction. Ned's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to fight, but he knew the truth. He could not win this battle. With a heavy heart, he dug his heels into his horse's sides and charged. Through the narrowing gap, just as the heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him, the sounds of the city faded into the distance. They were free, but at what cost? The wind howled as Ned Stark and his men galloped away from the walls of King's Landing, their horses kicking up dust as they rode into the open lands beyond the city. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and blood. Behind them, the great gates of the capital were sealed shut, cutting off any path of return. For now they had escaped. But the danger was far from over. Jory Cassel rode beside Ned, his eyes sharp, scanning the horizon. "They won't let this stand, my lord," he warned. "The moment Cersei regains control, she'll send riders after us." Ned nodded grimly. His leg throbbed, the wound from Jaime's sword aching with every movement, but he pushed the pain aside. There was no time for weakness. We need to move fast. We make for the Riverlands. The Riverlands were still a battlefield with House Tully, Stark's allies, locked in war against the Lannisters. But it was their best chance. If they could reach Riverrun, they would find safety with Catelyn's uncle, Sir Brynden Blackfish. From there, they could rally the north. One of the Stark men, a young rider named Tomard, pulled up beside them. "Lord Stark, we lost 3 men in the city," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "They bought us time, but we couldn't save them." Ned's jaw clenched. Good men had died for him today. Men who had followed him, trusted him. He had to make sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. "We'll honor them when we reach safety," he said, his voice firm, "but we are not safe yet." Jory nodded. "We should keep to the forests. The King's Road is too exposed." Ned agreed. If Cersei sent riders, the King's Road would be the first place they searched. They had to vanish into the wilderness, travel unseen until they were far enough from the Lannisters' reach. The group turned west, heading toward the dense tree line of the kingswood. The moment they entered the shadows, the oppressive heat of the open road faded. The forest was thick, dark, and silent, save for the rustling leaves and distant calls of birds. They rode for hours, stopping only to let the horses drink from a small stream. Ned could feel his body weakening, his injury, the exhaustion, the weight of what had happened, but he would not stop. Not yet. As night fell, they made camp deep within the forest. A small fire crackled in the clearing, the only warmth in the cold night. Jory sat beside Ned, sharpening his sword. "Do you think they'll chase us?" Ned stared into the flames. "Cersei will. She won't let this humiliation go unanswered. And if she believes I still have proof of her children's true parentage—" He trailed off. Jory exhaled. "Then she'll want you dead, before you can reach Robb." Ned's heart clenched at the thought of his son. Robb had likely already raised his banners, marching south, but he did not know the truth. If he believed his father was dead, he might strike blindly, walking into a Lannister trap. "I have to reach him," Ned said, "before the war swallows him whole." Tomard, who had been standing watch, suddenly stiffened. His hand went to his sword. "Riders!" he hissed. Everyone moved instantly, snuffing out the fire, grabbing their weapons. The sound of hooves echoed through the trees. Ned pressed himself against the trunk of a tree, watching. Silhouettes appeared through the branches, a dozen men on horseback moving fast. Not gold cloaks, not Lannisters. Something was wrong. The lead. Ryder slowed, raising a torch. His voice rang through the night. "Lord Stark, show yourself!" Ned hesitated. Then he recognized the sigil on their cloaks, the Blackfish of House Tully. His heart leaped. He stepped forward. "I am here." The rider, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, lowered his hood. It was Sir Brynden Blackfish. "We don't have much time," Brynden said. "The Lannisters have sent hunters after you. We need to move, now." Relief flooded Ned, but it was short-lived. The hunt was still on, and Cersei would not stop until his head was on a spike. The night was thick with tension as Ned Stark and his men followed Sir Brynden Blackfish through the dense trees of the kingswood. Their horses moved swiftly, hooves muffled by the damp earth. The Blackfish had brought only a dozen riders, but they knew the land well, guiding the group along. Hidden paths known only to river lords and smugglers. Ned's mind raced. If Brynden was here, it meant Riverrun still stood strong. That was good news, but it also meant war had fully begun. "How bad is it?" Ned asked, his voice low as they rode side by side. Brynden's expression darkened. "Your son marches south. The bannermen have answered the call. The Riverlands burn." A lump formed in Ned's throat. Robb was at war. The boy he had raised, the son he had tried to protect, was now a commander of thousands. The thought of him leading men into battle sent a fresh wave of pain through Ned's chest. "I need to reach him before it's too late," Ned said. Brynden gave him a sharp look. "Then let's hope we get out of this forest alive first." The warning came just in time. From behind them, the faint but unmistakable sound of distant hooves echoed through the trees. Fast. Organized. Cersei's hunters had found them. Jory cursed. "They're closing in." Brynden acted immediately. "Split! Up! They'll have scouts ahead waiting to ambush us if we stay together. Ride for the river!" The group scattered. Ned dug his heels into his horse, urging it faster. The branches whipped past him, tearing at his cloak as he rode through the dark. The sound of pursuit was growing louder. They were close. An arrow whizzed past his head. Another struck a tree beside him. The Lannisters were already in position. Before he could shout a warning, an ambush sprang from the shadows. A dozen riders, armed and waiting, charged from the trees. Ned barely had time to react before steel clashed. Jory was the first to strike, cutting a Lannister soldier from his horse. Brynden swung his sword with practiced efficiency, cutting a path through the chaos, but there were too many. Ned raised his sword, parrying an incoming blow. His injured leg screamed in protest, nearly throwing him from his saddle. He blocked. Another strike, barely holding his balance. A Lannister knight lunged toward him. Ned tried to dodge, but his body was too slow. The blade flashed, and suddenly a spear impaled the knight from behind. The Lannister crumpled, revealing the man who had saved Ned, a Stark rider bleeding but still fighting. But there was no time to thank him. More enemies came. A horn blast rang out through the trees, deep and thunderous. Ned's heart stopped. That was no Lannister horn. The ground trembled, hoofbeats, hundreds of them. Then they appeared, riders in grey and white, banners of the direwolf, streaming behind them. The North had come. At the head of the charge was Robb Stark. Ned barely had time to process it before his son was among them, sword flashing, wolves at his side. The battle turned in an instant. The Lannisters, outnumbered, were cut down in the chaos. Ned gasped for breath, gripping his horse's reins as he watched his son fight, not as a boy, but as a man. And then Robb was before him, his face fierce, his eyes burning with relief. "Father," Robb said, breathless. Ned could barely speak. His son had come for him. The North would not kneel. The battlefield fell silent. The last Lannister soldier let out a choked gasp before collapsing to the blood-soaked ground. The air was thick with the stench of iron and death. Crows had already begun to circle overhead, eager for their feast. Ned Stark sat astride his horse, barely believing what had just happened. His son, his boy, stood before him, no longer the eager child he had left behind in Winterfell, but a hardened warrior, his sword dripping with the blood of his enemies. "Father." Robb's voice was steady, but his eyes held emotion, relief, urgency, and something else, something colder. Ned exhaled, feeling the weight of everything crash down upon him. Robb. The moment should have been one of pure joy, but there was no time for sentiment. They were still in enemy territory, and every moment wasted could bring more Lannister reinforcements. Brynden Blackfish dismounted, wiping his blade. "We need to move. The Lannisters won't take this lightly." Robb nodded, his face grim. "We have scouts watching the roads. If they send another force after us, we'll know." Jory Cassell rode up, his face bruised but triumphant. "We cut them down before they could send word back. If we ride hard, we can be across the river by nightfall." Ned nodded. "Then we ride." He gritted his teeth against the pain in his leg as he urged his horse forward. Robb moved beside him, silent for a long moment before speaking. "They told us you were dead." Ned glanced at his son, seeing the barely concealed rage simmering beneath the surface. "I nearly was," he admitted. "Joffrey wanted my head." Robb's grip on his reins tightened. "He will pay for what he's done." Ned sighed. "Vengeance is a dangerous road, Robb." Robb turned to face him fully, his expression hard. "They killed our men. They imprisoned you. They sent assassins after Bran. This isn't about vengeance, Father. This is war." Ned saw it then, the cold determination in his son's face. The boy he had raised was gone. A wolf, now stood in his place. The sun was beginning to set as they reached the river. Crossing the twins, the great stone towers loomed ahead, their drawbridges raised. Walder Frey, the lord of the crossing, held the only safe passage over the Green Fork. Robb pulled his horse to a stop. "We need to cross." Ned frowned. "You mean to ask Walder Frey for passage?" Robb hesitated. "We need his men, father." Ned did not like it. He had known Walder Frey for years, and the man had all the loyalty of a stray dog, but they had no choice. Brynden sighed. "The Freys will demand a price." Robb turned to his father, his jaw set. "Then we'll pay it." Ned's stomach churned. He had spent his life fighting against the dishonor and deception that ruled this land, but now he was caught in it himself. And deep down, a terrible feeling settled in his gut. This war was only just beginning. The towers of the twins loomed like silent sentinels over the river, their cold stone reflecting the dimming light of the setting sun. The waters of the Green Fork flowed steadily beneath, uncaring of the war that raged across Westeros. Ned Stark sat stiffly in his saddle, his leg throbbing from the wound Jaime Lannister had given him. He barely felt the pain anymore. His mind was fixed on what lay ahead, Lord Walder Frey. Robb's scouts had reported no immediate Lannister pursuers, but that would not last. If they did not cross the river soon, they would be trapped between the Lannisters from the south and the Freys, who held the only bridge for miles. Ned turned to his son. "Walder Frey is not to be trusted." Robb's expression was unreadable. "I know, father, but we need him." Brynden Blackfish sighed. "The old weasel will demand a price. He always does." A horn sounded from the battlements of the twins, and a voice called down, "Lord Frey invites the Starks to speak." Ned felt an uneasy knot form in his stomach. Walder Frey did nothing without gain. Inside the hall, the stench of age and decay clung to the air. Walder Frey, ancient and wrinkled like a dried corpse, sat on his high seat, surrounded by his countless children and grandchildren. His milky eyes gleamed with amusement as he took in the sight of Robb Stark, his golden-haired mother's son. "Ah, the young wolf," Frey cackled, his voice rasping. "And the old wolf, too. I never thought I'd see you again, Lord Eddard." Ned held his composure. "We need to cross the river, Lord Frey. Name your price." Frey smirked. "Oh, straight to business, are we?" He leaned forward. "Your boy is fighting a war, and wars require allies." Ned didn't like the gleam in the old man's eyes. He had seen such men before, ones who held power not by honor, but by knowing when to betray. Frey tapped a bony finger against his armrest. "I want a marriage alliance. One of my girls for the young wolf." Robb's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. Ned narrowed his eyes. "You would barter for loyalty?" Frey cackled. "Oh, come now, Stark. That's how the game is played. You need my bridge, my men, my protection. In return, I want a king's gratitude and a queen in my house." Silence stretched between them. Robb looked at his father. "We don't have time for this," he said under his breath, and that was the truth. Every second they wasted here was a second Cersei could use to hunt them down. Ned hated it. He despised the politics of marriage, of duty forced upon a son who should have been free to choose. But war left no choices. Ned met Frey's gaze. "If we agree, will you grant us safe passage?" Frey grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "I swear it." Ned wanted to believe him, but something in the old man's smile felt like a blade hidden beneath silk. Later that night, as their forces prepared to cross, Ned found Robb standing alone by the river, staring at his reflection. "In the dark water, you're angry," Ned said. Robb exhaled slowly. "I swore I would choose love like you did with Mother." He turned to face his father. "Is this what it means to be a king? To be a piece on someone else's board?" Ned stepped forward, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "It means making sacrifices. It means protecting your people at any cost. Robb nodded, but his face was hard. Then I will do what I must. Ned looked into his son's eyes and saw it, the same unyielding will that had lived in every Stark before him. But he also saw something else, something dark, something born of war. As the Stark army crossed the bridge, banners waving beneath the moonlight, Ned Stark could not shake the feeling that they had just made a deal with the devil, and that the cost had yet to be paid. The river behind them was now just a silver ribbon in the moonlight, the twins shrinking in the distance as Robb's army rode hard into the riverlands. They had crossed, but the unease in Ned Stark's chest did not fade. War had a way of swallowing even the best-laid plans, and Walder Frey's easy agreement sat ill with him. A man like that never gave something for nothing. The Northmen rode for Riverrun, where Catelyn waited. The fires of war had already touched the land, villages burned in the distance, and the air smelled of death. The Lannisters were already here. Brynden Blackfish rode ahead with scouts, keeping an eye out for enemy forces. Robb led the bulk of their men, his face hard, his shoulders squared like a king riding to claim his fate. Ned rode beside his son. "We should not linger long in Riverrun," he said. "Tywin will be on the move. We cannot let him set the terms of battle." Robb nodded. "I mean to strike first." It was a bold statement, one that might have made Ned hesitate, but the way Robb said it, without doubt, without fear, reminded him of how the greatest kings led. His son was no longer a boy, but there was one last lesson he had to teach him. "Robb." Ned's voice was quiet, yet firm. "A battle is not just swords and shields. It is the choices. Before the fight even begins." Robb frowned. "You don't think I can win?" Ned shook his head. "I think you will win. But I do not want you to lose yourself in the process." Robb exhaled slowly. "Do you think I should have refused Frey's offer?" Ned looked ahead, the moonlight casting deep shadows across the land. "We had no choice, and that is what troubles me." But Robb had made a choice, and choices, in war, had consequences. They reached Riverrun by sunrise. The banners of House Tully still flew proudly, though the land bore scars of recent fighting. The men at the gates cheered as Robb Stark, the king in the north, rode through, and Ned could not help but feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Inside, Catelyn was waiting. The moment she saw him, her breath caught, her hands flying. To her mouth, "Ned!" He barely had time to dismount before she ran to him, clutching him as if afraid he might vanish. He held her close. "It's over, Cat. I'm here." Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, glancing at Robb, then back to Ned. "How?" Brynden Blackfish answered for him. "The boy king challenged Joffrey, and he won." Catelyn's face paled. "Gods!" She turned to Ned. "You fought him?" Ned hesitated. "I did what needed to be done." There was no need to tell her how close he had come to killing Joffrey, how Cersei had screamed for his execution. Robb stepped forward. "Joffrey is humiliated, but he still holds King's Landing. We cannot stop now." Ned saw the way the men looked at his son, not just as their leader, but as their king. The battle for the North had become a war for the Iron Throne, and Ned knew in his heart that there was no turning back now. That night, as he stood on the battlements of Riverrun, watching the torches flicker below, Catelyn joined him. "You're worried?" Ned nodded. "Robb is strong, he is brave. But war is not just won on the battlefield. It is won in the shadows, in the choices we make long before the swords clash." Catelyn swallowed. "And what choice do we make now?" Ned looked out toward the south, toward the land where his old friend Robert's throne sat empty, ruled by liars and killers. He had tried to do things the right way. He had tried to honor the truth, and it had nearly cost him his life. Now he knew better. "The choice," Ned said at last, "is to win." The day North had been wronged. Justice had to be served. The wolf had bared its teeth, and it would not stop until the Lannisters paid in blood.